as you can see in the slide here, you're going to create various layers, in your compost pile, which is a good way to mix the browns and the greens without physically mixing them. By layering them, you're creating an overall mix of materials that's suitable to serve as an adequate microbe food. But at the bottom of the pile, you're going to want to start off with a layer of roughage, which would be a layer of coarse material, like these sunflower stalks, like corn stalks, that will kind of create a more porous base layer of the compost pile that will allow air to flow in through the bottom of the pile and up through the pile. So here, like I was saying, sunflower stalks or corn stalks are great for roughage. Also, you could use small twigs. Any kind of coarse material that will, roughly roughly sit together to allow plenty of airflow through the bottom of the pile. And that should be about 3 inches or so of the material. So once you get your layer of roughage down, at the bottom of the pile, then you can add your brown material, which in this case is straw. Straw makes a really great brown material, but other brown materials are leaves, dried leaves, wood chips, sawdust would be a brown material. The thing with the really woody brown material is that it takes a long time to decompose. So if you're adding something like wood chips, for example, which are good to create bulk and create that porosity in the pile to allow for airflow. And they also are good food for fungi in the compost pile. But you'll probably end up having to sift them out from the final finished compost, because they will take multiple years to break down. So there I have my layer of brown material here, and like I said, 1 to 2 inches is good. And having thinner layers of material will encourage the pile to decompose more quickly. You won't have to turn it as much, but if you go with thicker layers, you're going to have to be turning that pile to mix those layers together so that you end up with a good mix of the browns and the greens throughout the pile. So 1 to 2 inch layers is a really good thickness. And so then after each layer, you're going to want to come through and water the layer. The garden hose is good to wet it down so you get about 60% moisture, like I was saying, in each of the layers. So it feels like a running out sponge. And when you're building your compost pile, it's really hard to overwater because a lot of it's going to kind of flow out of the pile if there's too much water. So you want to water each layer really well after you make the layer. So then I have my brown layer. So now it's time for the green material. So here, I was out yesterday collecting some green materials for the compost pile, some nitrogen-rich material for the compost pile. Here we have henbit. So, weeds from the garden are great as long as you're not collecting weeds that have mature seeds on them, or as long as you're not using weeds like, for example, Johnson grass or Bermuda that is propagated by a rhizome. You don't want to be putting weed propagules in your compost pile, not intentionally. So here we have some fresh green henbit. Also, I collected some purple vetch growing out there, which as a legume is a really good source of nitrogen in the compost pile. Also had collected some comfrey, which is an herb grown here at the Kerr Center, which is a good source of calcium and potassium and other trace minerals. So, I mean, that's one good thing about using a variety of plant materials, a variety of herbs and weeds and grasses, is that, you know, each one will accumulate kind of a different profile of nutrients. So by having a lot of diversity in your compost stock, your compost feed stock, you're in effect, you know, providing more nutrients to the finished product of that compost. And here I have some more weeds. In this case, thistles, and then some grasses. So then after I get the 1 to 2 inch layer of green material, then I'd water it down to make sure it's nice and moist. And at this point, you know, if I'm going to be adding manure to the compost pile, I'd add, you know, a thin layer of manure, about 1/2 inch. Really, I mean, with a compost pile like this that I'm describing, I would say, you know, you can use as much as 25% manure. The thing with manure is, since it's so high in nitrogen, you really have to balance it out with a lot of carbonaceous material. So in this case, when you're using a combination of green and brown material, you know, I would say 25% manure, you know, would be a good amount of manure to balance out the carbon. Though it is possible to make a pile with higher percentage of manure, you just want to have really carbonaceous material to balance it out, like, for example, wood chips or sawdust. So, you know, I'd add a thin layer of manure if I had manure. And then on top of this green material, I like to add soil. Add a thin layer, like a 1/2 inch layer of soil here. And what the soil does is it inoculates the compost pile with soil microorganisms. And also the clay component in soil will be used by the microbes to create a clay-humus complex. And that in itself becomes a really stable humus in your finished compost. And so you can use soil, or you can use you know, straight clay, like a montmorillonite clay. Some compost makers will use like a powdered clay that they add to their compost pile. But for a gardener, you know, adding a layer of soil or adding a layer of finished compost instead of the soil is a good way to inoculate the pile and also provide the clay. And then at this point, you could add something like biochar, which we make here at the Kerr Center. Biochar is great to add to the compost pile, you know, because of all the pores in the biochar. You know, you're going to end up filling these pores with beneficial microbes. They're going to colonize the biochar. And also the pores are going to be filled with moisture from the pile, and also nutrients from the compost are going to fill the pores of the biochar. So, you know, you could add a thin layer of biochar at this point. And then also, I mean, another thing you can add to the pile here is trace minerals, rock powders, rock dusts. Azomite is one material that I like to use, which contains potassium, calcium, magnesium, a little bit of chlorine and sodium, in addition to other trace minerals. But, I mean, some kind of rock powder like this is a good way to get, you know, a lot of trace minerals in the compost pile that will end up, you know, in your finished compost. And also, you're going to have the microbes in the compost pile, you know, working on these rock powders and kind of tying them up and chelating them, making them plant available. So, you know, in some ways, if you're gonna think of, you know, applying, say, you know, a rock powder to your garden, you might think about, you know, applying it to the compost first, and then using the compost as the vehicle to deliver those rock powders, those trace minerals. So at this point, you know, I'd water that layer soil and biochar and rock powder. And then after that, it's on for another layer of brown material. Gonna put some more straw here on the pile. And then, you know, once I get a 2-inch layer of that, I'm gonna wet it down so it's nice and moist, and then add another layer of green material. And then once that layer's on, I'm gonna wet that down, and then add the layer of, you know, manure if I'm gonna apply manure, and then soil and anything else, any other amendments I'm gonna add to that, and keep on stacking. And so you want your compost pile to start off at the base to be at least 3 feet by 3 feet. And then you're talking about, you know, with a small pile, at least, I would say at least, you know, 3 feet tall. But, you know, if you're dealing with a larger pile, you know, 4 feet would be a good height. You know, as much as 5 feet tall. You're going to end up with a lot of shrinkage as this material composts, decomposes. A lot of this carbon is going to be turned into carbon dioxide by the microbes, and also it's gonna kind of compress as the material gets broken down. So, you know, if you're starting off with a larger pile, it's going to shrink to about, let's say, you know, half to a quarter of its original size. And then, you know, after you're done with all the layers of brown and green material, it's good to cap the pile with a layer of brown material, with straw, for example, or hay. And that in itself will preserve moisture within the compost pile, and also, you know, keep it from drying out, you know, from direct sunlight, and trap some of the odors that might be coming off, as, you know, ammonia gas or other odors as the compost pile is breaking down. But yeah, there you go. There's a basic way of making backyard compost, on-farm compost, and it's, you know, it's best to have all the materials on hand so that you can build the pile all at once, and then maintain it from there. But say for kind of a backyard, a homeowner situation, you know, it'd be possible to make the compost in layers, you know, as you have food scraps, adding food scraps, and then covering them with brown material, and then adding another layer of food scraps, and then covering that in brown material. But, you know, you want to stick to roughly, you know, this ratio, the 45% green material, 45% brown, and, you know, about 10% soil or clay. And, you know, up to 25% manure if you're going to be adding manure. Yeah, so then you built your pile, you're maintaining your pile. You know, you need to water it when it gets dry. You need to turn it. You know, once it's getting above 130 degrees, it's good to turn it. You know, you don't want it to get above 150 degrees. But, you know, the whole process should take about 2 to 12 months. You know, the finished compost is going to be crumbly, it's going to be dark, it's going to smell like healthy soil. It's going to have that fragrant forest soil smell. And, you know, there are some ways to test the compost for maturity. For example, there are these Solvita compost testers you can purchase. Or you can do a seedling test where you put compost in pots and then plant seeds like cucumber seeds or lettuce seeds into those pots and see, you know, how those plants do in the compost. If you get really low germination rates in your compost, it's probably not mature. Or, you know, there might be really high levels of nitrates, for example, and you'll want to let it mature for longer. But really, you know, the maturation stage, so when it goes back down under 113 degrees after it's been hot for a while, that's when you get your fungi and your earthworms and your arthropods to kind of do that cold composting to continue to break down the material that's a little more resistant to decay, especially the more woody carbonaceous material is going to be continue to broken down during the maturation stage. And also during this stage, you're going to get the proliferation of things like protozoa, nematodes, and so you're going to get more microbially diverse and complex compost, if you allow adequate maturation.